So, well, this is the topic, is moving toward an ecological civilization. And, we've already been talking about systems thinking in just the introductory part. And what we'll be looking at through this presentation is a lot about the underlying cognitive systems in society and how we can transform society. In fact, how we need to transform society. And along with that, a lot of what we'll be exploring in the second half of this session is about reshaping the patterns of thought underlying that. This gives you a sense of where we're headed. But I think to begin with, let's kind of start with the big picture, if you will, our home. Well, here it is, the Earth from space, the only place we know of in the universe right now that has life. And here, life evolved billions of years ago, in this beautiful, filled out this beautiful, rich abundance. And then just a couple of 100,000 years ago, our species evolved as Homo sapiens. And then we've developed these incredible cognitive powers to have such amazing power over the rest of life on Earth. And so we have to ask, well, how have we been handling that incredible power we have? And as you're only too familiar with, we've been doing a lousy job, basically. I'm sure everyone's aware of some kind of chart like this about climate breakdown. We're headed in the wrong direction. We're headed at this rate towards a catastrophic rise in temperature of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius this century. And it would take significant changes to even get down to that 2 degrees Celsius rise, which scientists call a prescription for disaster. And even 1.5 degrees, which we might have already blown past, is considered to be not a safe target because of this zone of cascading, amplifying feedbacks that happen that cause this whole climate situation to be so out of control. But here's the thing, even if we were able somehow, through some sort of magic bullet, to really get a hold of and solve this climate crisis right now, and through some sort of technological system, whatever it might be, all that would do is actually unfold other huge ecological disasters that we are bringing to the Earth right now. Because underlying the climate crisis is a whole slew of ecological destruction across the board. Since 1970, in my lifetime, most of our lifetimes, there's been a 68% decline worldwide in animal populations. We're looking at the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth billions of years ago. Only this one is actually caused by one species, us. We are moving towards the annihilation, the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the UN projects that 95% of the Earth's land is going to be degraded by the middle of this century. And of all statistics, I think the one that just blows me away the most is this one, that at this current rate by 2050, there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in the short term, the underlying cause of some of this is this, what's been called by scientists, the great acceleration, since a little bit after the end of the Second World War, in the production and consumption of just about everything worldwide. And it keeps accelerating and is continuing to accelerate as we look into the future. So if we look at the amount of production going on today around the world, roughly $92 trillion of global GDP production, that's projected to triple by 2060. So all this destruction taking place, imagine triple that over these next few decades. And what we have driving all this is this growth-based global economy, which is driven by these overriding requirements to keep growing at all costs. And to do that by monetizing everything human activity and the Earth as fast as possible, turning humans as much as possible, as quickly as possible into just consumers, and exploiting every available resource on the Earth. And partly driving that, and as a result of that, is this, we live in a world dominated by these large transnational corporations, which are driven solely by the motive of shareholder profits and increasing those profits. So there are now 69 of the world's 100 largest economies are actually transnationals. So this is a system, a global system that is designed beautifully to mint billionaires, and has actually led to the greatest inequality in history, where right now, another mind-blowing statistic, the wealthiest 26 billionaires today own as much wealth as half the entire world's population of about 3.8 billion people. So when we look at these questions, it's not surprising that more and more serious-minded, sober observers are asking this question: is our civilization headed at this rate for collapse? Well, the big question is, or can we transform our society? What would it take to transform it to a flourishing future? We're going to explore that. But as part of the exploration for that, what I want to do is to begin by looking at actually how did we get here in the first place? And we're going to explore some of that before we move into where we might be headed. I think that's the necessary context. And that, as Tara and Garrett were describing, is a lot of what I explore in this book I wrote, The Patterning Instinct, a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning. And what we see in that book is there's been very few times in human history where there's been a fundamental transition of the way the human experience actually is experienced by people around the world. That first happened, the first change was about 10,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherer society moved to agriculture. Another change about 400 years ago. And then we can be pretty sure that we are experiencing in this century another of these great transitions. The big question is, where is it going to lead? Now, in that book, The Patterning Instinct, one of the big findings, the precepts, if you will, that bubbled up from it all, is quite simply this: that culture actually shapes values, and those values shape history. And by the same token, our values as a global society today is what will shape the future. And in fact, when we look at those transformations in the human experience, we see in each case there was a fundamental transformation of values happening that led from one to the other. So we're going to explore how to understand those transformations in values. And to do so, it helps actually to begin back with the title of that book, The Patterning Instinct, this unique human ability that we have to pattern meaning into things. So we're going to try to look at that a little bit better and actually come back to that later in the session as we explore our own patterning instincts a little bit. But to understand it, the first thing to recognize is that it's actually is an instinct. And we can call it an instinct because, well, even this little infant has it. Like, nobody teaches her, nobody says to her, you know, you need to learn the language of the people who are speaking around you. She just has this instinct to take the sounds, random sounds and actions she hears around her and actually pattern meaning into that. And that's how she learns the language of wherever she's born. And as she grows older, she learns the cultural worldview of wherever she's growing up in. Now, back in the earliest days of Homo sapiens, humans, our human ancestors, used that same patterning instinct to try to pattern meaning into the world. So they'd look up at the stars and they see these kind of random dots of light, but they pattern constellations into that to make meaning out of them. And similarly, when they look at nature, they pattern meaning into everything they saw around them in order to make sense of it. So let's take a quick look at some of those historical patterns. The first thing to understand about these patterns is that they begin with what are known as root metaphors. Underlying everything is this kind of core sense of what is nature, what is the universe, and then meaning arises from that kind of root metaphor. So first, if we look at our nomadic hunter-gatherer ancestors, and our ancestors spent about 95% of human history was spent as nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers. The way they made sense of the world around them was to see nature, above all, like a giving parent. That was their root metaphor. And from that, and then entailments, like logical implications naturally arise. If nature is a giving parent, then all living beings are family. And we all have an intimate relationship with the spirits of nature. We can trust nature to meet our needs. Everything is connected, and the natural world has intrinsic value. Now, that kind of pattern of meaning changed with the rise of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And with agriculture, the iconic shift that happened really was a sense of separation. I view this kind of, I picture the fence as iconic because it's a separation of humans from the wilderness out there as we started to learn to cultivate the fields. But equally important, it was humans separating themselves from other humans. So those farmers that got lucky enough to grow more crops then they didn't want to lose their wealth, their grain that they'd stored up, and then they would hire other people. And so we see the rise of inequalities, specialization, and hierarchies for the first time in human history. And people applied this understanding of their own society to the universe and came up with a new core metaphor of nature. So seeing it as the hierarchy of the gods. And with that root metaphor, a different set of entailments and values arose. There was a sense of the intrinsic value of wealth, possessions, and power. A sense that you can't trust the gods. You need to worship, you need to sacrifice, and a priesthood developed to intermediate between people and the gods. And above all, there was a sense that you had to respect the hierarchy and the patriarchy. This was also the source of the patriarchy. And now, for all different kinds of civilizations that arose over thousands of years in different parts of the world, they all shared these same core sense of hierarchical, patriarchal values until a new shift in meaning arose with the scientific revolution just a few hundred years ago. And with this, there was a new conception of nature that became dominant, the sense of seeing nature as a machine. And the excitement was that if you could see nature as a machine, you could figure out how it worked. And if you could figure out how it worked, you could basically conquer it. You could take dominion or control over it. And these are the words of one of the great prophets of the scientific age, Francis Bacon, calling on people around him to establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe. He said, we can render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And the Europeans, who got really excited by this, took that concept and applied it not just to exploit nature and take advantage of nature in the best way they could, but also to conquer other continents and take advantage of other peoples around the world as best they could. So this was the extractive kind of worldview that led to the modern dominant system of values that went around the world along with imperialism and colonialism brought by the West to basically pervade the rest of the world, leading to this modern dominant system of values that basically goes something like this. It says, it's really a story of separation. It says that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are separate from each other. And it says that human progress arises from that conquest of nature that Francis Bacon talked about. And from all that, then it becomes logical that the earth is just this resource to be used for human benefits. And ultimately, the purpose of life underlying all this is to then to get wealthy and powerful, to extract as much wealth as possible from the earth and from others around you. And that's led to this modern worldview based on separation. And some picture like this is what I see as iconic of that. People separate from each other, connected more to their technology, even separate from the food they're eating, which they don't even think about where it comes from. And this worldview pervades all of our media, all of the signaling, the messages we get from everything around us. So if you just turn on the TV and see the newscaster talking about whatever the economics might be of the day, the underlying message that she and everyone else is sharing is we're all separate from each other. We're all selfish. And by the way, that's great because we live in this capitalist system, which arises because through everyone being rational, selfish maximizers, it's the most efficient way to make our economy work. She tells us that nature is a machine, And the technology, therefore, is the solution to all our problems, even somehow enabling us to grow and infinitely, exponentially on a finite planet. And ultimately, underlying it all, the underlying message is everything is meaningless. And so just fill it with consumerism. And that's the set of values, that's the worldview that is leading to our civilization ransacking the earth in this existential crisis we're dealing with of climate breakdown. So then the question comes, where are we headed and what can we do to shift this worldview? What can we do to actually try to turn our civilization into something looks very different, like an actual ecological civilization? Well, you might be wondering, what is an ecological civilization that we're talking about here? The vision of an ecological civilization is the transformation in the very basis of our global civilization, from one that's wealth-based to one that is life-based. And as a result of that, transforming our whole global cultural and economic system to one that actually promotes sustainable flourishing for humans and the earth. And an ecological civilization would actually be based on the principles of ecology, which is really the understanding, the study of how living systems themselves self-organize. And if we look at ecologies around the world, they can remain resilient, healthy for millions of years without human intervention. And they can do that because of certain principles that actually drive their health and their the way that they connect with themselves. And that leads to a different kind of story for a civilization based on this kind of ecology, a story that we're all interconnected in the web of life. Now, I want to point out that this vision of an ecological civilization, certainly not just like my vision, and nor is it a vision that belongs to any one group of people. It's actually an emerging vision coming from diverse sources. It comes from indigenous models for life-affirming values. It comes from transformational work done in community around the world, things like transition towns, the rights of nature movement. It comes from engaged spiritual traditions like engaged Buddhism and deep ecology. And it comes from all kinds of progressive political movements around the world, all moving towards the same vision of a life-affirming civilization. So now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into looking at these underlying principles of ecology themselves, of an ecology itself, and how that leads to the principles of this vision of an ecological civilization. So we're going to look at some of these principles. And the first is probably the most important of all, is the principle of mutually beneficial symbiosis, where each party gains from a reciprocal relationship. That is foundational to ecosystems. It's foundational actually to the evolution of life on this earth. And if we think about how that could apply to a human society, it would lead to these core principles like fairness, justice, equity, individual dignity. Another key element we see in ecosystems is a concept known as holarchy. This notion of like the fractal way in which systems are all embedded in larger systems and larger systems, from the tiniest cell to the entire ecosystem itself. Each system is a whole part in itself and is also part of a greater whole. And that leads to this key principle that the health of the whole system requires the flourishing of each part. Now, another key principle we see in ecosystems is diversity, where the system's health itself depends on differentiation of all the different elements to it and the integration into a connected whole. And again, if we apply that to human society, we look at the inherent right of each person and community to participate in cultural, political, and economic power. Another key concept is balance. In an ecosystem, every part is in a harmonious relationship with the entire system. Things don't go out of balance. They actually come back into this dynamic balance. And if we apply that to our civilization, to modern civilization, that would lead to a steady state economy with an equitable distribution of wealth and power. Another interesting principle we see in ecosystems is that the decisions made by all the different parts of the ecosystem happen at the lowest levels. Like literally the grassroots, every piece of grass determines its own healthy decision making, which leads to the overall health of the whole system. In human society, that's known as subsidiarity, which is the principle of pushing the decision making down to the lowest level possible in the system. Then another key principle is this concept of embeddedness, recognizing humanity as being part of the living world, not separate from it, which I feel is best summarized in the slogan I saw in Paris during COP21 years ago. It says, "We are not fighting for nature, we are nature, defending itself." And finally, in terms of these principles, is this concept of regeneration, the notion of making decisions for our society based on sustainable flourishing into the long-term future, which is probably best summarized by the Iroquois Confederacy here in North America in their constitution, when they said, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. Now, I'm going to take us now to the next level of, if we recognize these principles of an ecological civilization, then we might start to ask ourselves, what would that actually look like in practice, in the real world, if we applied these principles? So I'll take you through just a high-level scan, give you a sense of what we might be talking about in an ecological civilization. Well, first is a vast reduction in this incredible global income inequality, a just transition from the fossil fuel economy, a global wealth tax, the institutionalization of a universal basic income, property being returned to the commons rather than being just in private ownership or state ownership. We'd be looking at corporations being fundamentally restructured so that they existed for humanity rather than just to increase shareholder returns. Now, many of you may be familiar with what's already out there. There's benefit corporations, and there's B Corp certifications, which are legal charters that companies can choose to have, which legally force them to consider the impact of their decisions on workers, customers, suppliers, community, and the environment. But right now, of course, these are voluntary, and virtually no large transnational corporations and choose them at all. Some small companies do worldwide. But in an ecological civilization, there would be what's known as this triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet required for corporate charters, which would lead to this fundamental reorganization of the transnational corporation with strict limits on advertising rather than forcing people to become these, like, get on that consumer treadmill. And these corporations would only get their charters renewed at the discretion of community representatives who determined whether they were actually really meeting these triple bottom lines. And we'd also see a shift in power, not just from these transnational corporations, but towards worker-owned co-ops becoming a major force in global commerce, which naturally bring ecological values like equity and fairness, solidarity, social responsibility. A great example of one of these is Mondragon, a very successful large co-op in Spain that's been successful for many decades, which shows that this can be done without a problem. We'd be looking at moving towards a circular economy, which would increase employment while reducing waste, with products designed for repair and recycling from the outset, sourcing these products from recycled materials, and the virtual elimination of waste in that. We're looking at the redesign of cities on ecological principles, community gardens on every block, the extensive use of energy efficient designs, rooftop gardens, aquaponics, cars banned from city centers, and essential services always within a 20-minute walk, no matter where you live. Outside of the city, in rural areas, we look at agroecology replacing global industrial monocrops based on the principles of permaculture, regenerative agriculture, which leads to greater crop biodiversity, greater water and carbon efficiency, the virtual elimination of synthetic fertilizer, and the elimination of factory farming. And we'd measure this ecological civilization in a different way, rather than GDP, which just looks at the rate in which we're monetizing the rest of the world. We'd be looking at something like a genuine progress indicator, which is a real life measure used today that factors in negatives such as income inequality, environmental pollution and crime, and positives like volunteer work, household work, and education, all of which are missing from GDP to measure our success as a society. On the global level, we'd see a muscular United Nations with enforcement powers over the global commons, over things like oceans, atmosphere, and the environment. And a UN Rights of Nature declaration that puts the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity, with personhood given to ecosystems, to rivers, to high-functioning mammals, and ecocide, the destruction of ecosystems, being defined as an international crime. So this gives you a sense of the kind of world an ecological civilization could lead to. And I imagine many of you looking at these ideas may be thinking, well, wonderful ideas, great, I'd love to live in this society, but we're so far from there right now. Really, how realistic could it ever be to get to that place? So I'm going to shift for a minute and just take you through a brief foray into looking at how change actually happens in human societies, because human societies are these very nonlinear living systems where phase transition can happen far faster, far more effectively than many people give it credit for. So just to give you a few examples first, we can look at something like women's suffrage, where Emmeline Pankhurst in 1897 founded the National Union for Women's Suffrage. She struggled for years just to get a few thousand people to march in London for the right to vote. And in face of massive opposition and going to jail, being even tortured in jail, within a couple of decades, women were gaining the right to vote across the world. Similarly, in the United States, if you look at the shift in civil rights, in 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. There was a bus boycott lasting over a year. Black churches were burned, Black citizens were arrested. Within less than a decade, there was the March on Washington with 200,000 plus people. That speech from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And within a year, the Civil Rights Act was passed into law by President Johnson. We see that in the Berlin Wall, when that went up in 1961 as the symbol of the Cold War, people thought they were going to be living with that through their entire lives and for generations to come. And then in 1988, Gorbachev began to loosen restrictions. Within a year, Germans were mobbing the gates. And just a month later, the Cold War was essentially officially declared over. And that Iron Curtain was no longer there. And we see these changes even much closer to our modern day. Only a couple of years ago, Greta Thunberg was skipping school, sitting by herself there outside the Swedish parliament with her solo protest. A year later, there's 4+ million school children and others in a global climate strike and climate emergency being declared by major countries in over 1,000 jurisdictions across the world. So what you see from this, the lesson from a systems perspective, is that public support follows a nonlinear path of change. And there's an early adoption phase when there's a sense of ideological lock-in. People stick with received attitudes and opinions, even when they're out of date, like social rigidity, political inertia, sense that it'll never happen. Then a tipping point arises, and you begin to see this crescendo of change where influential thought leaders attract increasing numbers. The natural human herd instinct shifts towards that new thinking, and that stickiness of the old thinking is superseded by the new. And then you begin to see this widespread adoption with new ways of thinking institutionalized. And there's always diehard reactionaries, but now they're in the minority. And then people begin to say, yeah, it was inevitable. So obviously the question is, what is the potential in our century for a transition to this fundamentally different kind of civilization? Well, one thing that leads towards that tipping point is the magnitude of this crisis, the climate emergency, the inequality, the environmental collapse. We're seeing these breakdowns of political norms. And along with that, the rise of the internet leads to this incredibly fast transmittal speed of new ideas and an emergent global sense of a shared identity. But then the challenge is that it has to happen so fast. Those other changes in human history happened over hundreds or thousands of years. This, we only have a few decades for at most. And this has to be an intentional change. We as a human species have to consciously change our own values and behavior. And clearly to do so would be to represent a unique achievement in human history. And underlying all that comes back this precept that I talked earlier, this recognition that culture shapes values. And values are what will shape history, and are values that will shape the future. So underlying this shift is a transformation in values, valuing the quality of life rather than material possessions, and prioritizing progress in quality, not quantity. Basing our political, social, economic choices on our sense of a shared humanity, emphasizing justice and dignity for all, and building civilization's future on the basis of symbiosis with the living earth, where the flourishing of the natural world is a foundational principle. So I'm just going to leave you with a couple of minutes to talk about this new book that Garrett had mentioned. We can talk about it a little bit more at the end of this session. That's coming out in June, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, because it's looking at this question of transforming values. And what this book does is it actually looks at that modern story of separation that I was talking about before, underlying our current civilization. And it shows that each of these ideas are not just dangerous, leading to this destruction, but they are false. They are actually wrong, just outmoded, based on those beliefs from the 17th century. What the book does is it shows how what modern science is telling us in these different fields like evolutionary biology, neuroscience, complexity science, leads to the same insights that traditional wisdom has been telling us for millennia, from indigenous knowledge, Taoism, and Buddhism, that we are all deeply interconnected. And the way the book works, and we can talk about this a little bit more, but it looks at these fundamental existential questions of who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? Why am I? That all humans ask, and that have been answered wrongly by our modern global civilization that have been leading us in this path towards destruction. So there's this potential that maybe here we have something like that root metaphor for that transformed society, this concept of a web of meaning where we're all deeply interconnected with each other and with all of life. So with that, thank you so much for listening to what I've taken you through. I look forward to now for a conversation. This is just a screenshot of how you can stay in touch with my work, and I'll get out of the screen share now.